Well, good morning from my online classes, both my full semester and second 8 weeks. I'm recording this on Monday morning, April the 4th, beautiful spring day. And here we are working on this material for Chapter 11, Interest Groups. And I know that we're winding down the end of the semester, so certainly make every day worthwhile and look over what you need to do, prepare for your research paper, prepare for the final. Chapter 11, Interest Groups. We have some overlap here with some of the other chapters that we've covered, especially Chapter 10, looking at money and campaigning, money and politics. So certainly focus the political power of interest groups as you remember the Citizens United case, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission 2010. So remember the impact there that corporations like individuals can give unlimited amounts of money to political campaigns. They can also give dark money, and that's through the tax code on section 501c4, way down there somewhere in all the multiple pages of the tax code. Social welfare groups can be political as long as it's not their primary cause. So you can give money. You can have a tax refund on it, and then also you can not the names why it's dark is that the names are not available to the public who gives to these causes. Now, you don't need to write all this down, but this helps to suggest what we've seen in recent research in political science by the Princeton political scientist Martin Gilens. I'd say that contrary to what decades of political science research might lead you to believe, ordinary citizens have virtually no influence over what their government does in the United States. And economic elites and interest groups, especially those representing business, have a substantial degree of influence. So he's really saying that we're an oligarchy and that the business community runs the United States. Very powerful statement. So the question for us is this true? And if it is true, what do we do about it? What do we as ordinary citizens do about it? Can we be involved? And can we join interest groups to help to counterbalance the power of the business interest groups? Well, at least currently, Gillen says we can't. And perhaps it's, again, with the decisions made by the Supreme Court to benefit, in particular, they may claim that it's benefiting everyone through the use of the First Amendment, but clearly those who have more money can benefit more. Supreme Court in the McCutcheon case, the Supreme Court removed limits on the overall amount that wealthy donors can give to candidates and political parties. So all of this is raising some real doubts about the reality that the rich are getting richer and everyone else is remaining at best the same. This is brought out by Thomas Piketty's book Capital, that those who can invest heavily in the market, the stock market, into stocks and other types of business investments, their income overall will continue to grow. But those who have to live off wages or a salary, at best, they're going to stay the same or decline. And so it's a major issue for our society, and perhaps explains politically why candidates who have tapped into this resentment and anger, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, have been able to have such success this year politically. Well, with all that said then, people still join interest groups. Roughly 70% of Americans belong to an interest group. So why join? And here we can see some of the reasons on pages 444 and 445. So let's focus on those reasons for joining. Solidarity incentives, companionship, socializing with others. I will call this either an incentive or a benefit interchangeably. So keep that in mind as you look over these pages. Companionship, socializing with others, certainly makes people live healthier lives if they have companionship and socialize with others. Purposive incentives, there's a belief that they want to change the world. They want the world in a better way than where it is right now. So environmental groups, religious groups might be in this category, ideology or morality. Economic incentives, certainly the business community, but labor unions can be in that category as well. material benefits, better income, better salaries, better protections for jobs and for certain kinds of businesses or trade can be some of the economic incentives. Well, you know, we tend to join. I mean, this has been the history of the United States now for well over 100 years. Back in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, a French writer, came to the United States and made this observation that America is a nation of joiners, that we have a tendency to want to join up with groups. And that is a way in which, in other areas where we can see that the number of political parties we have in the United States, the voting turnout, pretty low. However, when it comes to activity in interest groups, Americans are very active in that area, and that's a main way to share one's voice. However, even in this area, we're starting to see some decline, or at least there's been questions about the ability to be active among groups. And this was the main theme brought out in Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, landmark book. We've mentioned it here in class before, really in chapter 1. It's the first time we brought it up. What happens with people and their ability to interact in groups and to be involved in groups? Is it still happening, or is there a decline? He would argue that there's been a decline. This book now is over close to 20 years old, so there's some questions about its validity, but I would still say it's very influential. And so he looks at a 20-year span, the decline of civic affairs, the number of Americans who attended even one public meeting on town or school affairs in the previous year was cut by 40%. So we have seen a decline there in just people who are involved in finding out about public or school affairs. I can attest, now maybe it wasn't given that much publicity, but I think everyone who had a high school student in Miami School did get a note that there was going to be a meeting about the school bond issue coming up, and it was held at 6 o'clock, I believe. Maybe not the most ideal time. I attended, myself and 3 other people were there. So it gives you some idea that there does seem to be a decline in school or town affairs, although there's certainly town hall meetings where many people still do show up, some political party meetings that will have a fairly high attendance rate. And there are important ways in which civic groups do help our society. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. These organizations that I think for a lot of you, if you're here in Miami taking this class, or you're in your small town, wherever you're from, or even if you're from Tulsa or Oklahoma City, you can certainly see evidence that these civic groups have helped that community. The parks in this town are sponsored by Lions or Rotary Club, for example. Boy Scout troops have been sponsored by Masonic lodges. Masonic lodges give away awards on Student of the Day, Teacher of the Day. Rotary Club has helped with polio. Lions has helped people get eyeglasses. I'm just familiar with those organizations. I know the Moose Lodge and Elk Lodge do a lot of good things too. A branch off of Masonic Lodge, the Shriners, have 11 or 12 hospitals across the country that are funded in a way that people who need those hospitals don't have to pay at all. So we can see here that those groups are very important. And as you get a little bit older, those of you taking this class and more independent, I would urge you to look into joining some of these organizations and do your part to be involved in these civic groups, so that we can see here that local organizations joining groups is still very important in our society. And so perhaps there's different ways for groups to get together and think about interacting with one another, such as choosing mates. It's amazing how many marriages nowadays are established through the new technology online. So maybe people are interacting with each other, and not so much face-to-face, but online. There's symbols to the interest groups, and that's a way, of course, of being able to attract new members, to give some idea of what this organization represents. So the World Wildlife Fund using the panda, and I imagine a lot of us have seen the National Rifle Association symbols back of cars, for example. And so we can see how it's important to try to attract people to an organization. Now, one of the big issues is once an organization is established, it's got membership, it's symbols that people are attracted to. Who does it most attract? And we do see, like so many other ways of participating in our society, through interest groups, through voting, through accessing the media, there does seem to be a membership bias, that those who have more education and then tend to be wealthier are more likely to join interest groups. And so, like so many things, when it comes to participation, it does benefit one group of people more than others. And does that cause larger amounts of our society to fall behind other people? And that becomes a major question of the future for us, and what does it mean politically? Interest groups are certainly representing companies, so when we think of interest groups, it's important to keep in mind that companies would have lobbyists, those who work for an interest group representing a business and trying to have an impact on legislation in Congress. Congress, of course, will be our next chapter, so it's a nice dovetail from interest groups on into Congress. So these interest groups on banking regulations, for example, will be interest groups, and the people who work for the interest groups, lobbyists, who would represent Citibank and Wells Fargo. On health regulations, when it comes to pharmaceuticals, for example, Pfizer, one of the largest companies in the world, would certainly be represented. And when it comes to healthcare regulations, Aetna, a large insurance company, would be involved in that area as well. So the companies would certainly have interest groups and lobbyists working for those interest groups. It's important then for interest groups to try to give a positive message, just like our businesses as well as interest groups, to try to give a positive message as to what they represent. And so we can look at those symbols for the World Wildlife Federation, and then also for the National Rifle Association. Here we can see British Petroleum. It's institutional advertising, a positive image for the organization. So petroleum have a very spring-like, evergreen image. I think that's interesting that British Petroleum would do that. It stands for BP. They don't even have the British or petroleum in the labeling. So a way of trying to ensure that they have a positive image. All organizations work at that, of course. Now we can see the power of the interest groups by how they interact with two other main segments of our political system, our governing system, and that would be with the legislative committees and bureaucratic agencies. So certainly notice this on pages 454, 455, that the interest groups interact then with bureaucratic agencies like different branches of our military within the Pentagon, the Department of the Air Force, Department of the Navy, and then the legislative committees, the armed services. And so how those three then would work together. The Armed Services Committee, for example. Very important then to read about those pages and think about that interaction. This has led then to an incredible amount of defense spending, and on some very good things, but some things that perhaps didn't start off so in such a positive way. Some weapons are weapons carriers like the Osprey, which is a plane that can maneuver like a helicopter or maneuver like a plane. It's used by the United States Marine Corps under the Department of the Navy. Well, it was funded for many years, even though it wasn't effective, and actually was fatal for some people on board the plane. However, very intense lobbying effort managed to keep the Osprey going, and we spent a lot of money, taxpayers' money, keeping the Osprey going. And perhaps in the long run, that's good. Even when a product is not very effective, continue to fund it and hope that it will get to be effective. That's been the reality there to the Osprey. But how long should you continue to fund a defective product? That becomes a major issue there as well for the Osprey. It also has led then to an incredible amount of funding overall for our military compared to other military units around the world. Notice this on page 751 in your text. So hopefully we'll spend some time reading beyond just the first 15 chapters of the text. There's some really good information in those last 3 chapters. I know you've read some of that, I would think, in preparation for our research papers. But there you can see how much we spend compared to the next countries on that list. And it's interesting in the way that when you look at our political system right now, both President Obama and Mr. Trump do have something in common. Both of them have said that there are some American allies that are not paying enough of their own defense, that they ought to step up and pay more. Japan, Germany in particular should do that. So you wouldn't think perhaps that they would have that much in common, but they both have agreed on that statement. The Iron Triangle, though, we focus primarily on the military, but it is worth noting that there's other areas in which we see a considerable amount of funding as well as a result of that interaction between interest groups, bureaucratic agencies, and legislative committees, in particular agriculture. Should we continue to subsidize certain segments of our agricultural system? And that's government spending on farmers to supplement their income. This is done to manage the price of commodities. Farmers will tell you, I remember a farmer telling me that agriculture is the one business where you're punished for having a good year. So you produce more corn, then the price of corn can fall. So how do you make sure that the price doesn't fall too far? Supply and demand. And so that's where the government can step in with subsidies. And corn is the most subsidized of all the crops. It's the welfare queen of crops. Some of you are from Iowa, perhaps taking this class, and if you've ever driven through Iowa in the summer, the corn is up to the highway. It is everywhere. And it's subsidized. It's a crop in which if the price falls, the government will buy up the surplus. So that's why it's nicknamed the welfare queen of crops. And we make sure that there's somehow that surplus corn is going to be used in the market in some way. Well, beyond then to think about the interactions of interest groups and the strength of interest groups is to say, are there just some organizations that have more power than others, or is it even beyond this interaction of interest groups? And that's where you have these different theories on who ultimately holds the power. So one theory is the elite theory, where a group of wealthy, educated individuals hold most political power. On the other side of that, you have pluralist theory, and competing interest groups determine political power. So a great book called The Power Elite, very influential book. We have it over in our library. It came out in the late 1950s by C. Wright Mills. Argues that it's the elite theory that best explains the power structure of the United States. A few groups, handful of people really, a few people have tremendous amounts of influence and they decide. I think campaigning right now, you would see that Bernie Sanders would strongly argue that that's the way things are in our system today. And clearly, when you look at where the money went to the bailout, some of you are working on your paper on this issue, you can see that $700 billion went to the bailout primarily of banks. And most of it has been repaid, as I note here. But collectively, more than went to the homeowners. And they got their money faster than the homeowners did as well. The banks. Are the banks more important than the homeowners for our country? And are they, as we hear the phrase, too big to fail? And these banks have certainly grown in their power since the bailout back in 2008, 2009, the two bailouts. On the other side, though, you have pluralist theory, Who Governs by Robert Dahl, another very influential book. It's over in our library as well. He would argue that it is competing interest groups that make decisions on how we govern. So there are some people who have considerable influence, but they have that influence through an interest group. And so environmental policy, for example, Greenpeace, one group on one side versus National Association of Manufacturers on the other. And that's how decisions get made. I'm assuming that our more conventional candidates, Hillary Clinton, Ted Cruz, are more likely to believe in the pluralist theory. Some of the interest groups that are out there, it's worth noting one of the well-known interest groups in terms of labor policy has been a labor union known as the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, referred to as the AFL-CIO. So you'll read about this organization there in your text. It is important to note that we have seen a considerable decline in the last 30 years in the number of unionized workers, almost cut in half. Probably has been cut in half, really, when you get right down to it. So it was 20% of workers were unionized, now it's 11%, and that's probably on the decline. Let's a couple of slides left to consider here, and that is one way to kind of wrap this up, and that's why even join an interest group? Does it make sense to join one? And then use the term reason to consider this. The working of the mind on material provided by the mind itself. So just think it through. Does it make sense? Is it reasonable to join an interest group? And part of the issue there is that there has to be benefits. But if those benefits are a collective good, then that means the benefits are given to everyone, including non-members. If we come up with a better wage for everyone, then the unionized workers who argued for it, based on the policies of most states, they get the benefit, but so do those who are non-unionized. If there's an environmental group that comes up with cleaner drinking water or clean air through their policies, through their activities, they get the clean air and they get the clean drinking water, but so do those who are not members. And so we can be a free rider. We can enjoy the benefit, but we didn't have to participate to get that benefit. So what is our incentive to participate? That becomes always the demand and the question for interest groups. And this is brought out in a very important and influential book called The Logic of Collective Action. It's very much worth reading, by Mancur Olson, Public Goods and the Theory of Groups. Why join? And he would ultimately conclude that if you're going to have a collective action in a large group, especially in a country the size of the United States, 300 million people, over 300 million, then there does have to be some selective incentives for participants. And so people who join those groups get benefits. Then that comes back to, in a way, full circle. That's how we started. If we're giving benefits to those who already make more money than most, and they continue to get other benefits, contracts, subsidies, tax breaks, and they have more money to give, then they continue to get those benefits where others do not. So how do you counteract that with other interest groups? Is it possible to do so? Or are we going to be in a system where the few benefit far more than everybody else? A major challenge, as we can see here in our system today. And it's brought out to our attention, and it's something for us, I think, to rise up and accept that challenge and say, is this kind of system we want? If so, continue on. If not, let's figure out ways to make it better. That's the importance of our political system. That's Chapter 11, Interest Groups. Next time we're together, we'll be covering Chapter 12, Congress.